The R27 and R30 were known as the BMT Redbirds. They were the first cars to retire earlier BMT cars, the first married pair BMT R-types, and were retired far earlier than planned. Let's take a look at these fascinating cars. It was the late 1950s. The R16s were still fairly new. Nearly all of the original BMT subway fleet was still in service, and some of them were quite old. Several odd car types, like the low-V converts and ME1s purchased from the SIRT, needed to be replaced soon, and some BMT standards and triplexes were also nearing the end of their useful lives. The Transit Authority decided to order 230 R27s from the St. Louis Car Company. They were to be a continuation of the previous R16 cars, but as married pairs with longitudinal seating and many minor cosmetic changes. Since they were married pairs, they had one half-width driving cab and one half-width conductor's cab on each car. They had rectangular Railfan windows as opposed to porthole ones, and were the first types to use letter designations for BMT routes on roll signs rather than the dual contracts era number designations. The first train of R27s ran on the QT on November 15, 1960. At first, the R27s were assigned to the QT and QB versions of the BMT-1 route, and as more arrived, they spread out over the Southern Division. The R27s entered service without issue, so 320 identical follow-up R30s were ordered, entering service the next year in 1961, initially assigned to the Eastern Division. All R27s and R30s were delivered in a dark brown-green color. There were 5 subtypes: the R27WHs, R27GEs, R30WHs, R30GEs, and R30As. The WH cars had Westinghouse propulsion, the GE cars had General Electric propulsion, and the R30As had General Electric propulsion but used newer controllers. Together, the R27s and R30s retired all low-V converts, ME1s, MS multi-sections, all BMT standard trailer cars and a few motor cars, and many triplexes. They allowed borrowed equipment such as R9s and R10s to be returned to the IND and stabilized the BMT fleet. In 1967 and 1968, the Southern Division, Eastern Division, and IND Division unified into the B Division, and the R27-R30 fleet interspersed throughout it. In the late 1960s, many R27s and R30s were repainted into a bright red. However, this scheme wouldn't last long, as just a few years later, in the early 1970s, they were repainted into the MTA blue and silver scheme. This new paint was promptly ruined by graffiti. The MTA had little money to maintain the cars, and they fell into disrepair. Eventually, the 1980s arrived. After years of neglect, it was time for some overhauls. Over the course of the late 1980s, 24 R27GEs, 3 R27WHs, all R30GEs, and all R30As were rebuilt and repainted into the Redbird paint scheme, becoming BMT Redbirds. Now there were 5 subtypes: unrebuilt R27s, rebuilt R27s, unrebuilt R30s, rebuilt R30s, and R30As, which were rebuilt. The unrebuilt R27s and unrebuilt R30s were retired soon after by the R68s and R68As, as they were no longer needed, but the rebuilt cars of both types were expected to last about another decade. However, the MTA wanted all cars to be air-conditioned, and as the R27s and R30s were very heavy and complex, it was decided that AC would not be installed and the cars had to be retired. Ridership was on a decline at the time, so it was thought that the R27s and R30s would not be too much of a loss. The last R27s ran in 1989, except for 8042, which was mated to R30 8513 and retired a few years later. The Electric Railroaders Association ran a fan trip of R30s in May of 1993, and the last train of R30s made its last run on the sea on June 25, 1993. Their premature retirement led to a car shortage that lasted many years until the R160 order in 2006. Most R27s and R30s were scrapped by Sims Metal Management in New Jersey shortly after retirement. Parts from rebuilt cars were salvaged and used for other car types. Several cars of both types were kept as props for movies, but were also eventually scrapped. R27 8145 was a school car until 2011, finally being scrapped in 2013. No R27s remain today. Several R30s were used as school cars for training, but none still are today. A few were converted to rail adhesion cars and still run today. R30 8506 lost its mate in a 1975 accident and is currently on display in the New York Transit Museum. R30 pair 8481 to 8522 is stored and used as office space in 207 Street Yard. The BMT Redbirds had a very interesting history. They only ran for 32 years and very few exist today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.